This video is on Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She was born in 1689, so 1 year after Alexander Pope, her most famous literary enemy. When she was a child, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, she lost her mother at a young age, and then was raised for a while by her grandmother, who also passed away. And she also had a brother who died of smallpox. As a child, she educated herself. She was born into an aristocratic family and had access to a pretty extraordinary library. And although her father was not particularly interested in her education, she did manage to educate herself, and she taught herself Latin quite capably, and read quite voraciously, particularly British 17th century British drama. In 1712, in defiance of her father, she eloped with a man named Edward Wortley Montagu, who did not have an aristocratic title, and that was the reason for her father's opposition to the match. And later, interestingly, later in her life, she would advise her own children against certain matches that she didn't approve of. So she eloped with him in 1712, and eventually Edward accepted a government appointment in London, and she went with him to London, and there she found herself in the social world of literary men like Alexander Pope and John Gay. And these men, obviously, they found her remarkable, a highly literate, classically educated female, and encouraged her writing. And she began composing the 6 town ecologues, of which we're reading one, and they were not published until 1747, but she was writing them in 1714, and we'll talk more about these ecologues in a moment. In 1715, she became ill with smallpox, and that would scar her for life. And her brother, like I said, had died of the disease in 1713. And at this time, she composes the last of the town ecologues, which is called Saturday, the Smallpox, Flavia, and which deals with the illness, obviously. In 1716, her husband was appointed English ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, and they relocated to Istanbul in Turkey. And while she was there, she composed a series of letters on Turkish customs, and this was a world that was very foreign and exotic and mysterious to British readers, and so these letters were quite famous, and they're really what she's perhaps best known for today. And they were published after her death as the embassy letters, and they're pretty remarkable for her ethnographic descriptions of Turkish customs, particularly for the women in the Muslim world. By the late 1720s, her relationship with Pope had deteriorated, and they had been friends before she left for Turkey. Some biographers speculate that perhaps Pope had made some kind of overture to her to have an affair, and that she spurned him. That's certainly quite possible, but certainly their falling out had something to do with her intimacy with the Hanoverian court, and specifically Lord Hervey and Queen Caroline. And Pope satirized her, as well as the the members of the court in the Dunciad, and then he would do so later in his imitations of Horace. She's mentioned by him in the Epistle to a Lady, and again in the Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot in the 1730s, and Pope uses the name Sappho to refer to her. Sporus as Lord Harvey. In 1739, she becomes estranged from her husband, Edward Wortley Montagu, and falls in love with an Italian man named Francesco Algarotti. And she leaves England and would live abroad for most of the rest of her life. She fell in love with this man. They were supposed to be together in Venice. That plan eventually fell through, but she wound up never returning to England until the very end of her life, the last year or so of her life. And while she lived on the continent, in various places, Italy, France, she was exchanging letters with friends and family back home. And the letters are quite fascinating. In 1761, her husband died, and she returned to England to spend the last year of her life. So let's talk about the poem Saturday, which is one of the town ecologues. As I said earlier, she contracted smallpox in December 1715. She was 26 years old at the time and quite beautiful, but the disease scarred her terribly and left her permanently, wrecked her reputation as a society beauty. And the speaker in the poem is not to be mistaken for Lady Mary Wortley Montagu herself, but is a persona or a fictional speaker. And this is important with regard to some of the questions about this poem. So we have a persona, a speaker named Flavia, and she does seem to voice some of the poet's, some of Montagu's own fears and concerns during her illness, particularly with regard to the inept and insensitive apothecaries and physicians who were providing her treatment. One of the things that Montagu learned while living in Turkey was a primitive, sort of a crude form of inoculation against smallpox, and she had her own children inoculated, and she brought this knowledge back to England, and it was received with a great deal of skepticism within the medical community. But it turned out to be a quite effective treatment, and she's remembered today for having been an early proponent for inoculation. Shortly before her illness, with the encouragement of her literary friends, Pope and John Gay and others, she began composing a sequence of pastoral poems, and there were 6 of them total, that adopt the classical genre of the eclogue. An eclogue is a genre of pastoral poetry that originated in the ancient world, and Virgil, the Latin poet Virgil, wrote the most famous eclogues, and they're poems that are arranged in sequences according to the changing of the seasons or the months or days of the week, as in the case of Mary Wortley Montagu's eclogues. And typically they extol the virtues of simple country life as opposed to city life. And typically this is through the dialogue between shepherds or other rustic figures. And this genre had been popular in England for some time. Spenser wrote a very famous series of eclogues during the Renaissance. So it was a genre that was considered part of a poet's development. And Pope himself, some of his earliest poems are pastoral poems in the eclogue mode. Montagu, however, updates the genre by transporting the action from the countryside to the city, and hence the title of town eclogues that was eventually bestowed upon the poems. Despite having conventionally rusticated names like Flavia, Montagu's characters they're no rural simpletons. They are sophisticated, and they generally do not speak favorably of city life just because they live but just because of their city environment. And Saturday, as I said before, is the last poem in the sequence of town eclogues. So some questions to think about as you read. As how does Flavia come across in the poem to you? I mean, I cautioned you not to mistake Flavia for Montagu herself. So how does she come across in the poem? To what extent do you sympathize with her or not? And in what ways does she confirm or challenge Pope's remarks on women in An Epistle to a Lady, which of course was written many years later and says some pretty terrible things about Lady Wortley Montagu herself. But it's interesting to put this poem into dialogue with Pope's epistle. An epistle from Arthur Gray the footman after his condemnation for attempting a rape makes unusual demands upon the reader by asking us to empathize with a sexual predator, a known rapist. Like Pope's Eloisa to Abelard, this poem is an example of heroic epistle. And like Pope, Montagu adopts a persona of the opposite sex. This poem, unlike Eloisa de Abelard, which is based on something that had happened well before the 18th century, this poem is based on a real incident that Montagu's social circle knew about. In October, the fall of 1721, one of her friends named Griselda Bailey was attacked by a household servant, a footman, in the middle of the night. His name was Arthur Gray, and he was tried and sentenced to be hanged for his offense. Later, that sentence was commuted to transportation to the colonies. Some questions for discussion. I think the most interesting thing is that Montagu adopts the persona of a predator, of someone who attacked a woman. So why do you think she does that? Why is she more interested in Arthur Gray's point of view than in the point of view of his victim, Miss Bailey? And the second question kind of ties into this, is in what ways is the purpose of the poem, whatever you take that to be, however you answer the first question about why she adopts the persona of Arthur Gray, how is that complicated by Gray's social class, that as a servant, as a footman who is attacking someone who is an upper class, a member of the upper class? How does that class disparity complicate the purpose of the poem as you see it? The epistle from Mrs. Young may also be considered a heroic epistle, and similar to the epistle from Arthur Gray in that both poems adopt a speaking persona recognizable as one of Montagu's contemporaries. Pope's Eloisa de Abelard, he's adopting the voice of a historical person. But here, Mary Wortley Montagu is adopting the speaking voice of people who were known and in some cases alive. So Mary Heathcote, a friend of hers, was married to a man named William Young. Apparently he was very unpleasant, a London politician who was known for his infamously loose conduct with women, and I'm actually quoting the poem there. When Mary eventually took a lover herself, her husband, William Young, scandalized her through a widely publicized and very humiliating divorce case. And I quoted another line from the poem here: "Dragged into light, my tender crime is shown." And something to think about as you're reading this one is what is Lady Mary Wortley Montagu saying about marriage and about infidelity? I think clearly there is a double standard here, and she's trying to expose that double standard in her poem. So we'll want to examine that as a class. While Pope impugns the inconstancy of women in the Epistle to a Lady, Montagu responds by saying, "Yeah, so what? Men are the same way." And we see it not just in the infidelity of William Young, but also in Lord Bathurst, this was also a personal target because he was a member of Pope and Swift's social circle at the same time as Mary. And Bathurst is addressed by her as follows: "How happy you, who varied joys pursue, and every hour presents you something new." So men have the privilege of being inconstant and having different interests and being able to pursue them, and it being considered a virtue, whereas in women it's considered a sign of flimsiness and inconstancy. She also viciously attacked Pope himself in 1733 in the verses addressed to the imitator of Horace. This was a poem that was published. It was circulated. There's the title page for the first edition. It does not have her name on the title page. You notice it just says "by a lady." Mary Wortley Montagu never acknowledged her authorship of the poem. Lord Harvey, there is a manuscript with some corrections apparently in Lord Harvey's manuscript, and it's possible that most of the poem was written by Lord Harvey, but much of it is attributed to her. And a year after writing the verses addressed to the imitator of Horace attacking Pope, she set her sights on another scriblarian, this time Jonathan Swift, who published his grotesquely misogynistic poem, "The Lady's Dressing Room," in 1732. We're going to read this poem later. You'll see just how grotesque and appalling it is. So these two poems, both directly attacking Pope and Jonathan Swift, the two of the biggest intellects of the early 18th century. At this point, it's useful to start talking about different satirical modes. And one of them is called the Horatian mode, and the other one's called the Juvenalian mode. The Horatian satire is named after the Latin lyric poet Horace, and it's a gentler form of satire that aims for a humorous effect on the reader. It's not harsh or terribly degrading. I think The Rape of the Lock is a really good example of this kind of gentle, humorous satire. Certainly pointing out the flaws and foibles of Pope's aristocratic society, but it's not doing so in a mean-spirited, vicious kind of way. Juvenalian satire, by contrast, is the opposite, and it's named after the Latin poet Juvenal, and it seeks to rouse contempt and indignation. It's an angrier form of satire. You might think of Pope's portrayal of Sappho in which is Lady Mary Wortley Montagu in the Epistle to a Lady, or his portrayal of Lord Harvey as Sparus in the Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. It's mean, it's nasty, there's actual contempt in it. So as you're reading Lady Mary Wortley Montagu's poems, some of the questions to think about: in the Epistle to a Lady, Pope ridicules Flavia's impotence of mind as a female condition, but Montagu ridicules Lord Bathurst for the same reason. And what evidence does she present for that? How does she illustrate the impotence of mind of men like Lord Bathurst? And the other question is thinking about satire, and she certainly uses the Juvenalian tactics in her poems in retaliation against both Pope and Swift, and I want us to talk about that. So look for these tactics. How do you see her using Juvenalian satire to attack her intellectual and literary opponents? And that concludes the presentation on Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. Next, we will be looking at the poems of two women, Anne Finch and Anne Ingram.